There's this one line Vladimir Putin said in 2005 that has basically defined how the world understands him. The collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. You've probably heard it before. It's one of the most quoted things he's ever said. It's also central to understanding why modern Russia operates as it does. It's easy to hear that and think, okay, this guy just wants to turn the clock back to 1985. But that's not quite right. Putin doesn't want the Soviet Union's planned economy back. He is not campaigning to revive Marxism-Leninism or rebuild the Communist Party the way it was. What he does want is something much older. The reach, the prestige, and the fear that came with being at the center of a vast empire. And to understand that, we need to go back to the night when that empire, for him, started to crumble. In 1989, Putin was a KGB officer stationed in Dresden, East Germany. At that time, the Cold War still divided Europe, and East Germany was one of the Soviet Union's most tightly controlled satellites. The USSR was still a global superpower. It had the world's largest land army, a nuclear arsenal that could rival the United States, a seat on the UN Security Council, and alliances spanning Eastern Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Its ideology, flawed and often brutal, had shaped the politics of half the globe for decades. But in Dresden, Putin witnessed firsthand the fragility of that power. The Berlin Wall was coming down. Protesters were storming the offices of the Stasi, East Germany's secret police. Putin later described a night when a mob began moving toward the KGB building where he worked. He phoned his superiors in Moscow asking for instructions. The answer he got was chilling in its emptiness. Moscow is silent. For Putin, that wasn't just about being abandoned by his bosses. It was the moment when he realized that the Soviet state, this superpower that had seemed permanent, could suddenly just stop functioning. And 2 years later, it did. When the Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991, it wasn't just a political event. It was a geographic and cultural earthquake. Overnight, Russia lost 14 republics: Ukraine, Kazakhstan, the Baltic states, and many others. The country's borders shrank by a third. Its population fell from nearly 300 million to about 150 million. And with that collapse, the bipolar world order of the Cold War, the US and the USSR as the global superpowers, disappeared. The 1990s were brutal for Russia. Between 1991 and 1998, GDP dropped by about 40%. In 1992 alone, inflation was over 2,500%, wiping out people's savings. Soldiers went unpaid for months. Pensions vanished. Ordinary Russians were forced into survival mode. Elderly citizens sold their furniture in street markets. Young men joined gangs because the army couldn't feed or pay them. Organized crime thrived. Billionaire oligarchs, people like Boris Berezovsky and Roman Abramovich, took control of entire industries for pennies. And then came Chechnya. Russia fought a war there from 1994 to 1996 and lost. It was a small breakaway republic humiliating the Russian army. Internationally, Russia was ignored. NATO expanded right up to its borders in 1999, despite the memory of alleged Western assurances that it wouldn't. From Moscow's perspective, the West had abandoned Russia in its moment of vulnerability. For ordinary Russians, the decade felt like freefall. For Putin, it confirmed something he had already learned in Dresden. When Russia isn't feared, it's vulnerable. When Putin became president in 2000, he made it clear, sometimes with words, but more often with actions, that his mission was to restore Russian strength. At home, he brought the oligarchs under control. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, one of Russia's richest men, was arrested in 2003, and his company was absorbed by the state. Strategic sectors, especially oil and gas, came under direct Kremlin control through companies like Gazprom and Rosneft. Key government and corporate positions were filled with his former KGB and military colleagues, the Siloviki, or men of force. Abroad, Putin moved to reassert influence over the former Soviet space. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, recognizing two breakaway regions, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, as independent. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine, claiming to protect Russian speakers and return historical territory. From that year onward, Moscow supported separatists in eastern Ukraine, undermining Kiev's control. And in 2002, Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, openly framing it as a mission to reunite historically Russian lands. Other Russian officials have echoed this worldview. Nikolai Patrushev, Secretary of the Security Council, has repeatedly warned that any weakening of Russia is a threat to the whole world order. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has framed NATO's expansion as a direct threat to Russian survival. These aren't just Putin's personal obsessions. They're shared by the core of Russia's security and foreign policy establishment. Putin isn't trying to revive the USSR's ideology. He's not calling for state ownership of every factory or for exporting communism abroad. What he's reviving is an older Russian tradition, one that existed under the Tsars and under the Soviets, a dominant power at the center of the sphere of influence. That means a seat at the global table that rivals the United States. That difference explains not just his nostalgia, but his wars.